I missed my final exam because I attended an insane party instead. My parents absolutely went off on me and refused to give me money for another year of college, so I resorted to extreme measures to get it. I was attending an insane party where the first thing I saw upon walking in was a midget dancing on a pole. The host, a good friend of mine, came to me with a bottle of purple liquid and poured me a drink. I started sipping, and he pulled out a bag of mushrooms, then asked if I wanted to go to the shed so we could trip out. I of course said yes, and this is where things went wrong. I had way more than intended and started having an anxiety attack in the shed. I collapsed, and someone started performing chest compressions, and that's when the strangest thing happened. I suddenly realized I was the master of my universe, and I could just choose not to have this attack. Somehow, I became totally calm and stood up. I realized that nothing means anything anyway, and remembered the dancer. I walked out of the shed planning to challenge her to a pole dance-off, but just as I reached the back door, I tripped over a broken plank of wood and face planted into the wall. I passed out for the night, and when I woke up still on the ground, I realized my monumental mistake. Today was the day of my final exam. It was currently 9:30 a.m., and the exam started at 9. I instantly panicked. My heart leaped to my throat, and I jumped up so fast that I knocked over the lamp on the ground beside me, and it crashed to the floor, shattering into a million pieces. But I didn't care. I had bigger problems. As I stood up and zipped up my jeans, I realized I was wearing one shoe and couldn't find the other. I tore the garden apart and finally spotted it under the plank of woof. I grabbed it, threw it on, and bolted out, still half in a daze. I got outside, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop even more. My car keys? Yeah, they're locked inside my car. I don't even remember how that happened. All I know is that I'm standing there, hungover as hell, with no way to get to my exam. I start running, praying that I can somehow make it in time. There's a bus stop a few blocks away, so I sprint towards it, hoping that I can catch the next bus. But of course the bus was delayed. Apparently there was some accident on the route, and there was no telling when it would show up. At this point, I was desperate. I tried to call a rideshare, but when I found a driver near my location, my phone hit 1%. I rushed to press submit, and it started asking me for my credit card information. I reached for my wallet and ripped it open to get my credit card before my phone died. Just as I was putting in the numbers on the back of my car, my phone died. So I was standing there, out of breath, with no car, no phone, and no time. I didn't know what else to do, so I started running toward campus. It was 2 miles away, and I was not exactly in marathon shape, but I had no other choice. As I was running, I almost got taken out by some cyclist who was not paying attention. I dodged him, but then I tripped over some uneven pavement at a construction site, and I went down hard. I'm talking face first into the dirt, my ankle twisted, and my clothes were covered in mud. But I didn't have time to feel sorry for myself. I got up, limping now, and tried to keep going. By the time I finally got to the exam center, I was a mess. I'm drenched in sweat. Dirt was smeared all over me, and my ankle felt like it was on fire, but I made it. I rushed up to the door, only to be stopped by the security guard. He told me I was late and looked at me up and down. I pleaded to be let in, and he looked at the mud that I tracked in the hall, and then looked at me. I told him that I had overslept, and there was an accident, and I continued rambling, trying to make him understand, but it was over before it started. He told me that I missed the cutoff, and there was no way that he could let me in. He didn't budge. Eventually, he told me to leave, and I was too defeated to argue anymore. I didn't even remember the walk home. I was too stunned to process what had just happened. All I could think about was how badly I'd messed up. My heart pounded in my chest, not from the walk, but from the thoughts of what my parents would say, knowing that I had failed my last final. How could I explain that I missed my final exam because of Jared's party? My dad had always warned me about Jared, saying he was a bad influence, and that I needed to focus on my studies. And now, here I was, living up to every fear they'd ever had about me. I could already picture the disappointment in their eyes, and hear the anger in my dad's voice as he told me how I'd thrown away my future for one stupid night. I should have stayed home and studied like I was supposed to, but no, I had to be the life of the party, and prove I could hang with Jared and his friends. Each step home felt like it was taking me closer to my own execution. The anxiety clawed at my insides. My stomach churned, and my chest tightened. I couldn't afford to fail this class. I needed to pass to graduate this year. The next week, I went outside to check my dorm mail, and there was a letter waiting for me. It was from my college, informing me that I'd failed the year. I hadn't done well enough on my other exams to make up for the one I missed, and now I had to retake all my classes. Just like that, everything I'd worked for was gone. I called my parents, hoping they'd at least be supportive, but that was a mistake. They were furious. They accused me of being irresponsible and said that I was wasting my time partying instead of studying. studying. My dad said something about how he'd warned me not to mess around, and my mom just kept asking me how I could be so stupid. They refused to help me financially, saying I needed to learn from my mistakes. I should have planned better and been more responsible. I didn't even have the energy to argue. I just hung up. With no other options, I started working 2 full-time jobs over the summer to save up for the next year. One job at a fast food place, flipping burgers and dealing with rude customers all day. The other was at a warehouse, stacking boxes and loading trucks until my body ached. Those months were a blur of early mornings and late nights. I barely slept. I just dragged myself from one job to the next, trying to keep my head above water. But it wasn't easy. The warehouse job was especially brutal. There were long hours, heavy lifting, and supervisors who didn't give a damn about how tired you were. One day, I was moving a stack of boxes when they suddenly tipped over and crashed down on me. I ended up with a nasty wound on my arm that needed stitches. It slowed me down, but I couldn't afford to take time off, so I just powered through. The exhaustion started to eat away at me. Physically, I was drained, constantly sore, and running on fumes. Emotionally, I was a wreck. Every time I saw my parents, they'd criticize me, call me a failure, and remind me of how disappointed they were. They'd always been strict, but now it felt like they'd completely given up on me. I tried not to let it get to me, but it did. I started to feel like I was stuck in a never-ending cycle of disappointment. No matter how hard I worked, it never seemed to be enough. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong, how I'd let one stupid mistake ruin my life. About halfway through the summer, I started noticing something strange at the warehouse. There was this guy, a coworker I hadn't really noticed before, who always seemed to be watching me. Not in a creepy way, but like he knew something I didn't. One day he came up to me while I was on break, sitting on a stack of crates trying to stay awake. He introduced himself as Ben and asked how I was holding up. I shrugged, gave some half-hearted response and went back to staring at my coffee. But Ben didn't leave. Instead, he started talking about how he'd been in a similar situation when he was younger. He told me about how he'd screwed up, partied too hard, missed out on being an electrical engineer, and ended up working at the warehouse to make ends meet. At first, I didn't really care. Everyone's got a sob story, I thought. But then he said something that caught my attention. You know, sometimes life gives you a second chance even when you don't deserve it. The trick is recognizing it when it comes. I didn't know what to make of that, but for some reason, his words stuck with me. Maybe it was because I was desperate for any kind of hope, or maybe it was just because I was so tired, but I found myself thinking about what he said long after our conversation ended. A few days later, Ben came up to me again. This time, he had a proposition. He told me he knew someone who might be able to help me out, a friend of his who worked in admissions at a different college. He said this friend could pull some strings, maybe get me into a program where I could start fresh. At first, I thought it was a joke, but Ben was serious. He said he'd seen me working my butt off, and he thought I deserved a second chance. He gave me his friend's contact information and told me to think about it. I didn't know what to do. On the one hand, it seemed too good to be true. On the other hand, what did I have to lose? I was stuck in a dead-end situation, barely scraping by with no real prospects for the future. Maybe this was the second chance Ben had been talking about. So, after a lot of back and forth, I decided to take the leap. I hit up Ben's friend, and after a few conversations, it became clear that he really could help me. He pulled some strings, made a few calls, and before I knew it, I was accepted into a new program at a different college. It wasn't a prestigious school, but it was a fresh start, and the tuition there was significantly cheaper than the original college I was at. My parents weren't exactly thrilled when I told them about it. They were skeptical, especially my dad, who thought it was another one of my get-rich-quick schemes that was destined to fail, but I didn't care. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a chance at getting my life back together. Starting over wasn't easy. I still had to work to pay for tuition, but the new program was more flexible, allowing me to take evening classes so I could keep my jobs. It was exhausting, but in a different way. This time I felt like I was working towards something rather than just surviving. And it turned out Ben's friend wasn't just some guy who worked in admissions. A few months into the program, I found out that he was actually the dean of the college. It was then that I realized that Ben wasn't just helping me out of the goodness of his heart. He saw potential in me, even when I couldn't see it myself. As the months went by, things started to turn around. My grades improved, I got more comfortable balancing work and school, and slowly, I started to feel more confident in the path that I took. One day, while I was at work at the fast food place, Jared walked in. I hadn't seen him since the night of the party. He looked different, like life had hit him hard too. We talked for a while, catching up, and he told me about how things hadn't exactly gone well for him either. After the party, he'd spiraled a bit, dropped out of college, and was now working at his dad's auto shop. He apologized for what had happened that night, saying he felt guilty for pushing me and not making sure I got home safely. It wasn't his fault, not really, but it was clear he was carrying some of the guilt with him. He even offered to help me out financially, saying his dad's business was doing well and he could afford to lend me some money. I was tempted, but I turned him down. I didn't want to go down that road again, relying on someone else to bail me out. Besides, I was doing okay on my own for the first time in my life, and I didn't want to mess that up. We left on good terms, but seeing Jared like that made me realize how easily things could have gone the other way. If I hadn't met Ben, if I hadn't taken that chance, I could have ended up in the same situation or worse. The rest of the year flew by. Eventually, I made it through the program. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of times when I wanted to give up, but I didn't. I couldn't. Graduation day was bittersweet. My parents were there, but our relationship was still strained. Sure, they were proud of me, but the distance between us hadn't gone away. I think part of them was still waiting for me to screw up again. I couldn't blame them. I'd given them plenty of reasons not to trust me in the past, but even with all that, I felt a sense of accomplishment. I'd made it. I'd taken the second chance I'd been given, and I'd made the most of it. And in the process, I learned more about myself than I ever could have imagined.